All right. We are live with the Legal Eagle, Eric Segall, and always happy to have you joining me. We've got plenty to talk about. The parental rights movement had a big day at the Supreme Court yesterday. That's mainly what we're focused on, although there's plenty of other things, legal things to talk about. But let's spend as much time as we can on this because you think it's a huge issue. I think it's a huge issue. I've been in the auditoriums. People say trenches. I've been fighting for years the people in my town who have been attacking public education, much less around the country, working with teachers unions. This is an issue very close to my heart. So the conservative justices yesterday seem poised to declare that kids' exposure to certain kinds of books just in the library violates parents' religious expression is one way of putting it. You put it broader and differently, and you say this is a real attack on public education. What do we need to know about this case that was argued yesterday at the Supreme Court?
So this is a case that sounds like it's about religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, so on and so forth. And it's a little bit about that, but it's mostly about attacks on public schools. Let's start with the first thing. So the school district in Maryland where this case comes out of is one of the most diverse in the country. It is diverse, it is liberal, it is progressive. Those are just facts. And there are books in the library that are occasionally discussed in class that simply portray gay, lesbian, and trans folk as people deserving of equal respect and dignity, and portray same-sex marriage as an institution that deserves our respect. That's all it does. And it does so at age appropriate to whatever age we're talking about. Well, this, of course, made people really angry, and then it gave a weapon to the anti-public school people. So when parents started to want their children to opt out of having to be exposed, just exposed, Pete, to these books, the school district tried to accommodate that. They did. They tried to give notice and all that, but it didn't work because it was impossible, because no one knows in the school day when a particular child is going to take out a book from the library. No one can plan in advance when a student may raise in class some issue, 2 weeks after they read a book. It's just impossible to give parents notice in that kind of situation. So then a lawsuit was filed saying school districts have to give parents notice and an option to opt out of any exposure of their children to books that are simply about dignity to people who are.
Well, just to be clear, when you say exposure, the book could just be on a shelf in the library. It could be in a display case for LGBT awareness or something for a while in the hallway. It could also be being taught as the book the whole class is reading, but that is rare, if ever, that they choose a book like that because of the sensitivities around this. But when you say exposure, these parents, because I've been up against them, they don't want their kids to know or hear anything about sexual orientation or gender expression or sexual identity. They do not want their kids to know that that is a thing because they think their kids will then choose it as an option if they hear about it. That's my little rant about what they think based on what they say. But exposure is an important point, I feel.
Well, so one legal point, I don't want to talk too much about the law on this because the law doesn't matter. We have 5 justices committed to really destroying public education and committed to anti-LGBTQ rights. The law doesn't really matter. But I do want to make one point, Pete, that was made in numerous briefs, which is this case shouldn't even be in the Supreme Court. We have virtually no factual record. There are no facts in this record. We don't even know what the plaintiffs mean by exposure. Is it possible that a book sitting on a library shelf could somehow be unconstitutional? Of course not. That's obscene. These plaintiffs, the legal claim they're bringing forth is the free exercise of their religion is being violated by, frankly, not having a system where kids can opt out from exposure to these materials. One part of that is LGBTQ discrimination. Pete, hold on, let me finish the sentence. But a bigger part of it is they know, and this is what many school briefs said. There are a ton of amicus, friend of the court briefs here, and they all said the same thing. This is an administrative nightmare. This cannot be implemented. School districts would be in court every day on this. And that's the end game, to make public schools virtually impossible to run in a diverse environment, which is why the public interest groups supporting this lawsuit picked this particular district, Pete. They didn't pick Alabama. They didn't pick, rural Montana. They picked a really diverse school board that is trying its best to be inclusive, and they're not going to be able to under any kind of rules the Supreme Court announces. That's the major part of this case. And Justice Barrett, I want to make one more point about this. Justice Barrett, who with her, I think she has 7 children. I'm not sure. I know she homeschools some of them. Justice Barrett made 2 references to Maryland's compulsory public school education law. And this is why Supreme Court arguments need to be on TV. Of course, I couldn't watch it, but I listened to it and I replayed it 3 times. Her disgust at Maryland's requirement that people attend public schools with certain exceptions could not be hidden at all. And when a Supreme Court justice so denigrates public school education, it's just so sad.
I didn't follow what you said. Her disgust with what?
So at some point twice yesterday, she brought up the fact that in Maryland, they have a compulsory education law, which basically means you have to, go to public school until a certain age, maybe subject to some exceptions. She twice mentioned how coercive that was, and she implied it was wrong to make parents do that. We litigated this issue a zillion years ago. No parent has to send their kid to public school. They have a constitutional right, not in the Constitution, by the way, to send their kid to private school. That was decided like 700 years ago. Still, Justice Barrett had to point out twice her distaste for Maryland's law that basically requires you to go to public school subject to certain exceptions, like a religious opt-out. My point here, Pete, is this is not just about LGBTQ rights, although that part of the case makes me really sad. It is about making public schools, and this is the phrase, it's not a real word, but it was used in many briefs, unadministrable. If the Supreme Court sides with the plaintiffs here, it's going to be very difficult to administer curricula in public schools. That's the end game.
The end game, and this is such an important point, and the language around it that they use, they meaning anybody who's attacking public education. And I would argue I've followed education my entire career in life before it as a son of a public educator, someone who went to public schools. Obviously, it's always taken different versions. The attack on public education. I'm thinking you as a scholar and basically historian of the Supreme Court.
Can I give you an example real quick? Right in that sentence?
Let me just make sure I finish this point because I want you to talk for as long as you want about this. This is a larger attack. This is not about these books, or it's not about LGBT. It's not about sexual orientation. It's called parental rights is what they call it. And there's all these right-wing religious law firms or organizations like American Defense Fund, ADF, I believe.
There are a bunch of others. Yeah.
And so many more, of course. But this is an all-out attack on public education curriculum, what you can teach, what you can do. So, and then I was thinking, yes, there's a history of this. And finally, you mentioned their point is their religious freedom is under attack. And I remember having an argument with one of these parents because their kids on the National Day of Silence, where you're supposed to go silent to be in solidarity with the LGBT community. Well, there was a whole counter movement in a middle school in my district called like the straight kids. And they were poking literally and physically like irritating these kids, trying to get them to talk. Anyway, in the argument, the woman says, "What about my rights?" I go, "What rights?" She goes, "My religion." Just to be clear, their view is they're not able to practice their Christian, always religion, as a result of the LGBT movement or anything else that we want to take. And you can go back to race. I'm done.
No, I don't want to go back to, I will go back to, there's 2 points I want to make, one history, and then first responding to what you just said. The piece I wrote today in Jurist on a journal called Jurist on this topic makes
I'll link to the point.
Nobody, in this case, nobody's religious exercise was affected. No school official was telling anyone their religion was good, wrong, or indifferent. No one could be stopped. Nobody was stopped from praying. There's no religious content to this at all, other than I am religiously offended by these materials. But the Constitution refers to the free exercise of religion. No one's exercise of religion is being affected by anything in this case. So this is a use of religion for another goal. And hold on, we've seen this before. I have to make this point. This is exactly what religious groups did in the 1950s and 1960s. It offends our religious sensibilities to send our white children to public schools with black children. That was an entire huge movement in the 50s and 60s. Now, that movement was about race. I concede that. That movement wasn't about public schools. That movement was about racism. But it was the same thing, using religion to justify political attacks and other attacks that really have nothing. There's nowhere in the Bible or the Quran or any place where it says white children and black children shouldn't go to school together in public schools in America. And there's nothing in any book of faith that I've ever heard that says anything about, LGBT people shouldn't be treated with respect, except for that one line in the Bible about man laying with man.
Well, they would say my religious freedom is being impugned or attacked. Yesterday, by the way, Pam Bondi, did you see this? Pam Bondi led up a whole task force yesterday at the Department of Justice to talk about the concerns of Christians being attacked. And I mean, this has been going on for a very long time in this country. They're the victim. Vast majority of Christians think that they are discriminated against, and they would say that it is against my religion to be gay. So you're teaching my kids that it's
that's a great. So yesterday at the argument
that it's okay to be gay, to be trans. It's against my religion. So
yesterday, Justice Jackson, I believe it may have been Kagan, don't hold me to it. I think it was Jackson, asked the plaintiff's lawyer this question. And it was a great question. She said, under your theory of this case, if a parent of a religious child thinks that trans people are by their very existence offensive to their religion, and they don't want, does that child get to opt out of a class that has another trans student in the class? Because the justice said, your reasoning would apply to that situation. And the plaintiff's lawyer was very taken aback by it. Said, no, of course, that would never happen. That parent would lose. But no explanation why that case would be different than the case they brought. And in fact, under their legal theory, the justice was correct. Anytime a parent feels that their child is exposed to something that offends their religious conscience, they can make this argument. And that's the problem, Pete. I want to repeat, nobody's religion was in any way affected, discussed, made light of. Nobody was not allowed to pray. There's nothing religion going on here, except in the brains of these parents, they have a conscience objection to LGBTQ families. That's it. And before the Roberts Court, that free exercise claim would have been laughed out of existence.
It's a religious objection, to be clear. Overwhelmingly, people who are anti-gay marriage, much less anti-abortion, overwhelmingly they are Christian.
The text of the Constitution, this is a constitutional case brought under the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, which refers to the free exercise of religion. So when someone wants to exercise their religion and government puts a burden in that way, then that's a problem. And we got to talk about that. If they make it harder for you to get to church during COVID, all of the shutdowns of churches, those were arguable free exercise claims because people couldn't actually get to where they wanted to go to exercise their religion. Nothing like that is happening here. Nothing. Nothing. Pete, it's one thing to say, you're interfering with my prayer, you're interfering with my wearing of a yarmulke, you're interfering with my religious exercise. It's another thing to say my brain hurts because I have an objection to something that offends my religion. And that's not a claim, that should not be a claim under the free exercise clause, but the Roberts Court has used that to basically limit LGBTQ rights, and it's going to do it again in this case.
Let me just leave the legal world for just a second. Take your legal hat off. I know you don't like to, but just
no, I love to.
Well, all right. It's just, why is it always about sexual orientation, gender, reproductive rights?
It isn't. In the 60s, it's about race.
And then obviously about race. It's not as much overtly about race, the arguments that they make now, but in these cases, but it's never about anything else that the Bible, it's always sexism, and racism and anti-gay stuff. There's so much more in every religious text, and they never cite those things. Also, they're not focused on a book in school that has a Muslim character or a Jewish character. So it's not other religions. It's so clear to me that these are a certain type of Christian who feels that their religion is under attack. It's not Jewish people, it's not Muslim people, and it's never anything but your private parts, related to your private parts, it would seem. Is that a...
Yes.
Why?
Yes. By the way, one of the plaintiffs in this case is Muslim. Yes. It is. It is. By the way, conservative groups love to find Muslims willing to bring this kind of case so they can say, see, the Supreme Court doesn't just rule for Christians, they also rule for Muslims. This is a common...
To be clear, the point must be made that religious people of any religion are problematic. Fundamentalists are very problematic, and I've got plenty of negative things to say about Muslims, but the reason why I don't talk about Muslims and Jews is because they're like 4% of the country. They have no power. This is a Christian thing. I'll criticize all religion all the time, but I'm most likely to criticize the most powerful religion in our country.
So Pete, I was thinking about the great question you asked, and when I said yes, and
when was that, in 2009?
I want to amplify this a second. The reason why today it's about sex and orientation and LGBTQ and trans and same-sex marriage is because those are the cutting-edge social issues of today. Those and guns are the cutting-edge social issues. Back in the 1960s, the cutting-edge social issue was segregation. And then there was religious objections to that cutting-edge issue. So my answer to you is a big part of this, and I think you will sympathize with this. I hope the audience does too. They just don't want change, Pete. They just don't want change in gender roles, in sexual roles, in society roles. White and black children were separated in Southern schools for 70 years, 80 years. And changing that was just dramatic for people who don't want to change. LGBTQ folks could not get married until very recently. Changing that is what they're rebelling against. So whatever is the cutting edge social issue of the day that causes change in society, that's why immigration is well, Pete, because they're afraid of change.
One change that
do you agree with what I just said? Do you agree? I'm curious your opinion.
I fully agree with that. But I also, as you're saying, I'm trying to be a devil's advocate, and I'm thinking about all the change that I personally don't like. And what I keep falling back on is like, oh, well, but all the things I'm thinking about that I don't like, the change that I don't like, has nothing to do with social issues. It's the fact that I have to check out with a self-checkout and not a person.
Me too. Yes, man. Go.
But one thing you didn't mention, just real quick, take a departure on it. One change I'm against that took place, when was Loving, Virginia?
1967.
I think we should stay together marriage-wise. Whites and whites, blacks and blacks, and so on. I'm against interracial marriage.
You're going to be aggregated. Be careful.
Well, no, my real question is why didn't I feel like I don't know that much about the movement to end miscegenation? I feel like I only know like that Supreme Court.
There wasn't a movement. And at the time that Loving was decided,
we're talking about all these other issues, social issues. And then, as I mentioned, LGBT, sex and gender. I just feel like there wasn't a major movement to end.
A couple of things are going on there. At the time that case was decided, 1967, I believe 13 states prohibited interracial marriage. 13, may have been 17, but less than 20. So more than half the states, weren't caught up in any of that. Pete, the world was different back then. Social movements took very different forms. So I haven't studied that social movement, but I have studied in detail the social movement to end segregation and how Thurgood Marshall in the 1930s started a long, multi-decade litigation process, first in graduate schools, and then eventually in elementary and secondary schools. That was a full-blown social movement. Even that, though, in a non-internet world, takes a very different form than what we're used to. The other thing was in 1966 America, Pete, as I understand it, elites, whether it was Georgia, Virginia, Arizona, New York, most elites did not want bans on same-sex marriage. The elites were already there. So there really wasn't a need for a big social movement about that. That was not true for segregation in 1954 when William Buckley in the 1950s was still fighting the segregation. The elites fought desegregation. I do not believe the elites, like Bill Buckley, made a big issue about interracial marriage. So they're very different things.
I'm okay with interracial straight marriage. I'm against interracial gay marriage.
But
Where's
Pete,
my
the big point I want to make
party?
is none of this, whether it's interracial marriage, whether it's segregated schools, whether it's segregated pools, whether it's LGBTQ rights, and et cetera, it's not about religious exercise. When someone who does not distribute or sell expressive items for a living, once you sell expressive items, free speech comes into play. But if you're just selling widgets and you don't want to sell widgets to gay couples or same-sex couples because your religion forbids that, Pete, that's just your conscience is mad, but you can still exercise your religion fully. Justice Antonin Scalia, the worst justice by far of our lifetimes, said himself in 1990. Scalia said, we can't live in a country where people can opt out of laws because their religious conscience is offended. That would put judges in the middle of balancing religious issues versus secular issues. Scalia said this, not Segall, not Dominic, Antonin Scalia.
Religious conscience is objected is the legal language he used. But going back to the language you used, they don't like change. Of course, religions and cults don't like, but it's something different. They don't like new ideas to be introduced. It's very easy to control your kid's brain and mind until they get into the public, until they get into school, on a school bus. And, for me, if it wasn't like, I was always going to leave Catholicism and religion, I'm sure, but it came earlier because I was introduced to George Carlin. I mean, that tape, his tape is what, so when you hear these other ideas, which school teaches, it generally creates critical thinking. And if a kid's born and raised in this specific religion, that's why they homeschool. Because
Pete, yes, and George Carlin was fabulous on these issues. But I want to make a point here.
Yep.
These materials are not materials that try to pretend one thing is better than the other, or religions are bad.
Introduction of the idea of it, that it exists, and then saying the whole idea of all those books and all these things in school, the display case, the rainbow. It's a simple idea. It's to, quote, normalize it. They don't want it normalized. We want to say gay people are not deviants or bad or sinners. That's why we have all these things in schools. That's why they're there, to let them know that they are human, just like you. They are equal to you, but they don't want that. They don't want that to be.
Something else has changed, which I really want to emphasize this point, because it's why Justice Barrett is so awful in every way. In the 1960s, if you did not want to go to public school because you didn't like the way the public school was operating because it violated your religion, Pete, you didn't have many choices. There weren't a lot of private schools. There were virtually no magnet schools of any kind. But your choices were extremely limited. When Congress effectively ended legal segregation in this country in 1964 in the Civil Rights Act, it also gave $1 zillion to private schools, which led to white flight in the 60s and 70s. And now, if your religious sensibilities are offended by public schools, in many, many, many states, you have the option to get tuition vouchers in private schools. There are cheap private schools, that you have all kinds of alternatives. What Justice Barrett was trying to say yesterday was it's not fair to coerce people to go to public schools and then engage in behavior that offends their religion. That might have been a non-terrible argument in 1953. But in 2025 America, it's a stupid argument, because almost everybody had, in fact, my tax dollars in Georgia now go to pay private school tuitions. I hate that. That offends my religious sensibilities. I'm sure it offends yours. Not religious sensibilities, my sensibilities. Yet that's what I have to do. My tax dollars go to help pay kids who don't want to go to public school, go to private school. And Pete, that's what Justice Barrett and the Supreme Court won't recognize. They also won't recognize what an incredible administrative burden this is going to be on overworked, low-paid public.
I'll have to get somebody from the education world to talk about that burden that this could create. By the way, we're live right now on YouTube, and it brings another element because there's a live chat, and some of my favorite listeners and friends are joining. Benny Alexander writes, wait, Scalia is worse than Thomas? Carlo then writes, is Eric saying that Scalia is worse than Thomas? And then Kim writes, is shit worse than vomit?
I'd like to address that real quick if I could.
Yes.
So Thomas is a much more corrupt and worse justice than Scalia. It's not close. Scalia is much worse because, Pete, it's not fair to judge Supreme Court justices in the 1920s by today's standards. It's just not fair. They're all racist. They're all sexist because all of America was racist and sexist in the 1920s. Justice Scalia compared homosexual conduct to murder in the 1990s. Justice Scalia wanted VMI to be all men in the 1990s.
The Military Institute?
Yes. Taxpayer dollars funded elite public institution, 7-1 case. Thomas recused himself. 7-1 case. And Scalia is the one person saying a publicly funded elite school can exclude all women, and there's no constitutional problem with that. He was a sexist, racist, homophobic person by the standards of his day, and his jurisprudence is a direct link to originalism, the Federalist Society. So his impact is 1,000 times more than Thomas. That's what I mean.
Wow. In the YouTube chat, the ghost of Scalia says, "Shut up, Segall." Huh.
He once told me that, actually.
Ghost of Segall now joining.
He did. In front of 500 people, he told me to shut up. That's true. He did.
Culture Wars, Public Schools, and Religious Supremacy at the Supreme Court is the title of this piece that Eric wrote at jurist.org. I'm not I'm not missing that you just said what you said about Scalia. We're always honored to have you here, but the truth is your credibility and your longevity of your career, the things you've seen, the people you've met and lectured with and debated is long and impressive. At the end of this piece, you write, at least 5 of the justice will rule for the plaintiff. So in this case that we're talking about, the plaintiffs are the baddies. So at least 5 of the justice will rule for the religious.
Sorry, Pete. Justices. You keep saying justice. Justices. I hope it says justices. Does it say justice?
I read it wrong. Everybody watching heard it right.
Yeah.
You are wrong to correct me. I was really in a flow. At least 5 of the justices will rule for the plaintiffs, which will pose, quote, effectively insurmountable burdens on public schools.
That quote is from a brief by education administrators.
That quote is from a brief by education administrators, so that's not yours. This will lead to more chaos, more arguments about how terribly public schools are treating our children, which is such a really important point. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They come to destroy a thing, and then once they're destroying it, they're like, look how bad it is over there.
Exactly.
And
that was well said.
And well, it would have been better said if I made it funny. They're coming to take a school and turn it into a landfill and be like, oh my God, it smells terrible. Yeah, you turn it into a landfill, fuckface. Then you write, and all this is happening because public school administrators and teachers in this school district simply want to teach their kids that it is okay to be different. And every person deserves dignity and respect. If only our country's most important judges felt the same way. Do you think it's okay to be different?
I think it is not only okay, I think it's desirable. And by the way, that's it, Pete. That's the answer to the question you raised earlier. Religious folks fear change. That's just a generalization. I mean, devoutly religious folks, and I'm willing to stand by that statement.
Got to ask you about 2 other cases, I think, at least.
Sure.
I just want to say, and correct me if I think I'm wrong, the only thing I know is communication. And it doesn't mean I'm necessarily good at it, but I'm pretty good at seeing, oh, that's working. That's really convincing people in a debate or on a radio show or whatever. And I think I'm pretty good at having smart people on my show and dumbing down some of the language and the messaging. And one of the things I think that we got wrong in the campaign was talking so much about democracy, because I heard this messaging expert say, democracy never put any food on anybody's table. Nobody knows what that means in this country because we've always, quote, had democracy. I feel the same way about those of you, and I'm pointing at you, Segall, talking about habeas corpus and due process. Stop saying those words. Use other words or use an example of what it means to have it or not have it. And that will, and think of the right winger who could be wrongly accused of something like, I don't know, beating up his wife or any number of things. Because when people use habeas corpus and due process, it doesn't mean anything to anyone. And I just don't know how to tell all of you smart people that nobody knows what the fuck that means, especially not habeas corpus. Stop. Thank you.
Justice Scalia wrote a dissenting opinion in the Hamdi case, which in the 2000s, which involves an American citizen, but it's the same thing for immigrants who are here and are entitled to hearings. Justice Scalia said that there is no provision of the Constitution more important than, I'm just going to say what really fast, than the habeas corpus part of the Constitution, because that's the only thing that stands between us and the executive branch, the president arresting us, throwing us into a foreign prison, a domestic prison, throwing us in the ocean without a hearing, Pete. The only thing that stops the executive branch from disappearing people, maybe, is that a good word, disappearing people? The only thing that stops that is the writ of habeas corpus. You don't have to believe Segall. You can go read Scalia's words in the Hamdi case. So, Pete, no, we've had discussion before. I cannot impress upon you enough the difference traditionally between America and, let's say, Russia. In Russia, if Putin wants you gone, you're gone. You're gone. That's never really been true in America. Not really, until last week and a couple weeks ago. And that's terrifying, Pete. It is terrifying. How is that?
That was great, but I actually will quibble with disappearing. It almost sounds like a lefty war on terror.
Okay, arrest without cause and no hearing.
No, I would say abducting and kidnapping, or like what they did to the Jews, like just putting people in mass on trains and in camps, because that's the logical conclusion. But right now, if they're taking people one by one or in smaller groups, they're taking them. They're abducting them. They're then sending them, in some cases now, to a whole nother country.
Yes, just yes.
It's nothing like what we were aghast and appalled by what the Bush administration did to suspected terrorists in Gitmo and in black sites and secret sites all over the world. We were, but at least those people were pretty suspected, often cases connected to the Taliban or Al Qaeda or some movement.
Pete, hold on, sorry, Pete, I got to correct you there. Maybe
some of them were not.
But the only reason we know that, but the only reason you can make that statement with confidence, and it's true, is because they got hearings. And the Supreme Court made them get hearings. But wait a minute. President Bush marched into court 3 times in the 2000s after 9/11 and said, I need a blank check. To fight the war on terrorism, you have to give me a blank check. I don't want any limits. And Justice O'Connor, of all people, said, you don't get a blank check. That's not our country.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the argument back about Gitmo was, should these terrorism suspects, like certainly the 9/11 plotter Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, should they receive military tribunals or?
No, that was the second argument. The first argument was they deserve anything.
Okay, so let me lay it out, because you really are very interrupting. I had 4 choices.
Okay, sorry.
Is it military tribunal, criminal trial, or is it assassination and withholding in perpetuity? Like, it's those 4 choices were kind of what we had then, but it was really about, should they be put on trial at all or just be detained indefinitely? But now it's something I feel like so much worse than that.
Well, not if you were Hamdi. So Hamdi is an American citizen who was picked up in Afghanistan, but there's no evidence he was doing anything wrong at all. He may have been, we have no idea why he was there. The Bush administration detained him, said we can hold him indefinitely without trial for as long as we want.
I'll tell you what's different in my mind. He was in Afghanistan, a citizen of another country who, whatever, doesn't matter.
He was a U.S. citizen. He was a U.S. citizen in Afghanistan.
But he was, okay, again, not defending that at all, but this is why it's different. These are people that are living and working in America, and people should be even more aghast, because the reason is, again, communicating and messaging. This is more likely to happen to you or someone you know or someone in your town than what happened to Hamdi in Afghanistan.
Yes, and the point Scalia made, again, I almost never start a sentence with saying, and I agree with Justice Scalia, but again, the point Scalia made, I don't agree with him about all of this, was that if you are an American citizen, Pete, unless you are coming at the government with a gun, on the battlefield, everything is different. But if you're just an American citizen anywhere in the world and our government arrests you, the government has 2 choices. give you a jury trial in front of your peers, or Congress can suspend, I'm sorry for the words, the writ of habeas corpus in times of a rebellion or invasion. That was Scalia's point. Scalia's point. Now, these people so far have not been American citizens, but they are legally entitled to be here. And Scalia would have applied exactly the same analysis, to your point, to any person on American soil. If you're on American soil, Scalia said, you get a jury trial or you suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Like, those are the only options. And Trump is doing neither of those things.
Are you ready for the Legal Eagle with Eric Segall lightning round, which is no different than the rest of the interview, except it's supposed to be brief answers?
Yes, sir.
All right. How bubbles of trouble? You okay?
I don't know what bubbles of trouble means.
When you tum is okay, you're having a tummy issue.
I'm perfect.
Okay, here it is. Ready? Other issues that are not what we've talked about today, but just got to get your quick take on them. The Supreme Court yesterday appeared likely to, a federal judge yesterday agreed to block the Trump administration from dismantling Voice of America, the 83-year-old international news service created by Congress. A U.S. district judge ruled that the administration illegally required Voice of America to cease operations for the first time since its World War II era inception. Segall, lightning round.
Haven't studied it. My gut is that decision is correct.
The administration's other legal setback: a federal judge in Colorado directed President Donald Trump's administration to give Venezuelan migrants detained in that state notice 21 days in advance before any deportations under a law historically used only in wartime, and to inform them of their right to challenge their removal. Segall, lightning round.
I hope to God that's affirmed, Pete. That's everything we're talking about right there.
And finally, outside the legal realm, the executive...
NBA? You going to talk basketball finally?
The greatest arena to watch an NBA game live in.
Okay, I'm from New York, and I hate it when New Yorkers think everything about New York is great. And I'm not one of those people. I've not lived there for 45 years. But Madison Square Garden is the Mecca for a reason.
Finally, the executive producer of 60 Minutes said he was going to resign because he lost his journalistic independence. This show is almost as old as you are. What do you think about what this means for media, for speech? I'm not sure if you've read into it, but basically,
I've looked at this.
The issue here is about they're putting pressure on Sherry Redstone, who owns Paramount, who owns CBS, where 60 Minutes in. She wants to merge with another media company called Skydance. She can only get approval if she does what the Trump administration.
That media company, Pete, is owned or run by some billionaire's child who is close to Donald Trump. Forget the guy's name. This is terrible. It is just terrible. In a nutshell, lightning round, the 30 year, I think he was there 30 years. The 60 Minutes producer basically said, I can't do my job in this environment. I just can't. I'm being too pressured. 60 Minutes used to be a show that I have a lot of critiques of 60 Minutes, but his position was, we need to be able to present what we want to present. And in this corporate world, I cannot do it. Sad. Really, really, really sad.
And finally, in the chat, Justin asks, what's Eric's analysis if the emergency opinion the Supreme Court released at 1 a.m. halting deportations and Alito's subsequent sissy fit?
Well, it didn't halt all deportations. It was much narrower than that. Pete, this law that Trump is using has been used 3 times during the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. And the intent of the law he's using, because it's a really drastic law that gives the president emergency powers. The intent of it is simply when we're actually facing extinction, when we're hit by an invading force, then the president needs to have emergency powers. It was never, ever intended to be used on immigration issues. Just never. And Pete, we have a lot of laws like that were initially passed to give the president emergency powers in times of war, which is why you keep hearing Trump use that word, the war on this, the war on that, because once those laws are triggered, the Supreme Court is almost always going to stand down, almost always. So that's the problem. These laws on the books that were passed give the president basically martial law power in times of war. I think we need laws like that. We do. But they have to be interpreted by the judges incredibly narrowly. And I don't trust this Supreme Court to do that.
Thank you so much for that and for everything else. Love it. Love you. Appreciate you joining us. Thanks for everybody who watched live. Everybody else will have to wait for it to come out on the pod or watch anytime on youtube.com/stand up with Pete. Do you want to plug anything?
No, yes, I do. I want to plug an idea. I'm finding solace these days in you, my family, my friends, and my non-political, non-legal activities. For people who are peripherally working or involved, or people who just think about this stuff a lot, we have such little. We have power, Pete, but individually, hug your family, be with your friends. It's
super awkward because I was actually going to end our friendship today.
That'll make me really sad. Thank you, buddy. I love you.
You're the best. Love you, buddy. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
All right. There he goes. You leave. Leave the studio. Hit
X. I'm leaving. Bye. I'm leaving. Bye.
There he goes. He's probably going to the bathroom. Folks, listen, I just want to thank you, those of you who joined live. I'm going to probably cut this part out of the podcast, but this is fun. And I love your feedback because the one thing I worry about is it's like somebody's like, oh, this is such a different experience. It's watching the interview that you hear on the podcast taped, watching it live. And I'm with you. I have the same experience watching other people do it. So let me know if it's okay, if you like it. I hope you like it because I like doing it. And I love the chat and I love having people here. And mainly I love Rachel Spitz because she said, I appreciate you. And Julie. Thank you, Julie. Thank you for the efforts. I think that was probably more for Segall. Yeah, reminds me a bit of the old Sirius show. Yeah, being live is great. I miss being live so much. I miss taking calls from like randos and regulars. Randos and regulars. I just love that part of live. And I want to get back to that. I do something that is part of, it's just so much work. But I said that when I first started this, I was like, I'll get back to live at some point. The hardest obstacle, which is weird that they don't have an AI for this, is getting someone to screen the calls. To do a good live show, you need to see who's calling so you can curate who you want to go to. Because if it's like fucking, you just don't want to put some annoying person or horrible person or boring person on the air because you don't want to be rude and be like, bye, I gotta go. So you want to curate the calls and you need a call screener for that. And that's a real person's job that gets paid $12 an hour. So anyway, thank you, Julie. Appreciate it. Long time, first time, Justin. And old Ziggy used to call. Yeah, Ben. I remember that guy. Oh, wow. Going back. Good pull. Thanks, guys. I'm going to end it now. I will talk to you later or never. Maybe I'll never talk to you. I could die between now and the next time. So live for the moment. Find the joy. Find peace. Namaste.